Geek Charming. Not the most well-known film, but there's a lot of great stuff in here. My one-sentence review is, I love this movie, but I hate its first 9 minutes. Let's just get that section out of the way, so I can focus on the good stuff. The opening of this movie is horrible. Patently and unequivocally. I understand anyone who didn't make it to the good part, because everything in these first 9 minutes, from the dialogue, to the structure, to the jokes, to the pacing, is an embarrassment. When I say the jokes in the opening are bad, I don't mean corny puns like most of these movies have. I mean they're the kind of joke that makes your stomach tighten in horror, the kind of joke that has you mapping out the room's exits, and the most efficient way of reaching them. Just listen to these.
You geek! This is designer!
No, it's tuna noodle casserole.
You are so gross!
Gross is just one syllable.
Ugh. The first one is already agonizing, and the second somehow tops it. I challenge you to find one joke in any girly movie that's worse than either of those. But there's an even worse offense immediately afterward. Not just bad lines, but bad storytelling. Here's an overwrought rewind effect, and I'm not doing that, that's the original movie, so it can show us what happened directly before the fettuccine incident. Okay, so the accident was her fault and not his. Cool. But here's the thing. Stop the scene right there and move on to the next. You've made your point. When a basketball player makes a shot, they have to turn around and jog up court. They can't just stand there staring at the hoop for half a minute. This movie just stands there though. Watch what happens next.
You geek! This is designer!
No, it's tuna noodle casserole.
You are so gross!
Gross is just one syllable.
It shows us those jokes a second time, right after we just heard them. The most excruciating jokes I've heard in years, and I have to relive them. This movie is somehow proud of those lines. Perhaps you're thinking, well, they have to repeat that part of the scene because they're going to show us something new that comes afterward. And technically that is what happens, but nothing actually new was established in this extended scene. Just retreading what we already knew or could figure out. It's a complete waste of time. I have to reiterate, this movie does get better, much better, but not yet. Josh goes to his own clicks table, and we have some nice subtext with his female friend having an unspoken crush on him, only it doesn't stay unspoken.
You could have asked her out and haven't.
I'd go out with you.
She just tells him, and the audience, out loud how she feels. Ugh. Is this going to be one of those movies that doesn't have any subtext? Apparently, yes. The scene changes, but the dialogue isn't any better.
Yeah, Mr. F, I'm struggling here. I've got all these great ideas, but none of them are good enough.
So, you don't have any great ideas. Let's just skip to the good part. I don't like being negative. Here's a scene 9.5 minutes in, and the first time the movie shows some promise.
Seriously? This is not refundable. Tell you what, here's 20% off on your next phone.
If that exact gag appeared in a sardonic satire like They Came Together, it would without question be hilarious. Josh's recompense is framed as so heroic and selfless, yet we know it to be completely ineffectual. That is the type of coupon the store probably gives out for free in their weekly circular. I laughed out loud the first time I got to that punchline, but its placement at the end of that 9-minute dead zone I just waded through made me wonder, was that joke on purpose? Was it supposed to be a joke? Did the writers know what they just did? I had to keep watching to find out. And sure enough, by the end of the next scene, I was convinced these writers are a lot sharper than they seemed. This scene in the fountain is a genuine old-timey farce. There's an absurd premise, it plays out ridiculously, everything about it is exaggerated, and it escalates to inane degrees. But what sells it the most is his tag at the end with the shoes. Watch this. That is not a detail a feeble writer would come up with. I am sincerely impressed. And the scene's not even over yet. Look at the way Dylan sneaks this cocky look to her friends for approval on her lame burn.
Not so fast.
I have a proposal for you.
Whatever it is, the answer is N-O. Spells no way.
Or listen to this exchange when Dylan thinks Josh's documentary about her will give her a fighting shot in the upcoming pageant.
The competition just got serious. It's always been serious for me.
That's a solid gag. Between that, the shoes, and the coupon, I laughed out loud 3 times in only a few minutes. How often does that ever happen, with any kind of movie? This is turning out to be good after all. And it stays good until the credits roll. Instead of walking scene by scene through the whole thing, let's take a step back. What else about this movie is good? Most of its joy comes from watching these two opposites explore each other's worlds and slowly warm up to each other. It's a relationship that likely wouldn't work in real life, but that's the whole point of movies like these, to give us these impossible experiences. The Incredible Hulk couldn't shapeshift in real life either. Where does all that extra matter come from, and where does it go? But that's not the point. You're not supposed to get bogged down in practicality. It's long been my theory that girly films' closest analog is sci-fi films. But instead of the fantastical conceit being something technological, it's social. It's exaggerated interpersonal dynamics. Geek Charming's central argument is that cats and dogs can live together, so that's what we pretend to believe while we watch it. It's a nice message, but what impresses me even more is the film's unstated accomplishment, getting us to empathize with the leader of the popular girls. That's who Dylan is, the school's queen bee. And she's not the villain. We assume she is at first, because we've been so thoroughly trained to by other films. We pick up on her seeming cruelty and vapidness.
If you're a 10, you can only date a 10, like Asher.
And yes, it is fun to laugh at how airheaded and vain she acts. But some of the things she says make a little sense.
Everyone thinks it's so easy being the popular girl.
It's so not easy.
It's like royalty or being the first lady. You have to live up to impossible standards of beauty, and you're expected to be a good influence.
And the more we get to know her, the more we see her humanity, her struggles and motivations and hopes and fears, and we realize she never really did anything wrong to deserve our earlier scorn. If you don't think that's remarkable, I ask you this. What is the last movie you saw that had a Queen Bee character who wasn't a villain? Can you think of any? The only one I could was Clueless, and that was 16 years before Geek Charming. Pop culture as a whole has this weird hatred of popular girls. Why? I also have to give credit to Sarah Hyland, who portrays Dylan. She's obviously beautiful and charismatic and looks good in all of her wardrobe changes. But the longer the movie goes, I started to wonder, is she secretly a good actress too? Some of the early emotional scenes feel a little forced, perhaps beyond her control, but that fight at the end, I was with her. I felt everything I was supposed to. And when Hyland wants to turn on the charm, wow can she do it. We have to talk about the scene on the beach, where Josh interviews her for his documentary. This is still early in the film when we're viewing her as vapid and shallow. She's answering his questions, and she cannot stop mugging. She keeps making these ridiculous poses into the camera during the interview. And it is funny, but it's also extremely endearing. She looks amazing in that hat, and even though those poses are a little goofy, they're also really good. They could be on a magazine cover. I don't know how else to put it. If your heart isn't warmed by this scene, you may not have one. This is what Truffaut called the joy of cinema. Perhaps you think I'm shallow for praising the scene on that level. But let me ask you this. How many adult men are still raving about Marilyn Monroe's vent scene 60 years later? And I'm not only talking about John Q. Public, I'm talking about cinema scholars, college professors, the American Film Institute, Quentin Tarantino. The same people stuffily analyzing Fellini's mise-en-scène are taking photos of themselves next to statues of Monroe clamping down her dress. That image is part of the American mythos. But I defy all of you to give me one good reason why Marilyn Monroe standing over that vent is any deeper than Sarah Hyland mugging in her hat. And remember, we're talking about serious cinema studies here. Your argument isn't allowed to mention female anatomy or undergarments, because you'd sound really juvenile. Back to the movie. I mentioned how this film subverts our expectations about popular girls. It disrupts a few other conventions as well. For instance, here's a classroom scene in a girly film, and the teacher is covering something other than Shakespeare.
Heavy infantry.
How often does that happen? No, but seriously, consider what this movie does with the geek's arc. We've seen tons of nerdy girls with glasses get makeovers and become beautiful, and then slowly walk down the hallway to every onlooker's awed astonishment. How many times do you see a guy have that transformation? It feels progressive somehow.
Josh, see you in AP English.
I also have to point out, I was making fun of the lack of subtext in the beginning, but this film can be understated when it wants to. Consider how much information is exchanged in every one of these two rivals' silent glances. Or think about everything going through all three characters' heads in this scene.
Oh, Josh, new hair. Oh my gosh, a girl.
Hi.
The first Josh is brought home. Oh, I need to get my camera.
No, you don't. I bring girls home. Tons.
There are some unspoken implications I didn't even notice until my second viewing. Not only do we root for Dylan and Josh to come together, I think we're supposed to subconsciously expect their parents to get along. Both of them are single, both like the other one's child, and this comparison is never acknowledged, but both of them are into Japanese culture. Josh's mom makes sushi, and Dylan's father has Japanese artwork in his home. What if that's not a coincidence? Geek Charming even has some good photography. Look at this shot. Look at it! While we're at the movie theater, I want to talk about how great the last few scenes are, so here's a spoiler warning for the rest of my video. The theater sequence is surprisingly clever. In the beginning of Josh's documentary, the audience laughs at how vapid Dylan is. By the end of it, they empathize with her and respect her. Does that sound kind of familiar? Like the exact same arc we went through when we watched Geek Charming? Laughing at Dylan and then respecting her? We judge the audience for being so condescending until we realize we did the same thing ourselves only an hour earlier. They are our cipher, and we are judging ourselves. Film analysts gushed when Quentin Tarantino used that technique in *Inglourious Basterds*. Why didn't they gush about this Disney Channel original made for little girls? Maybe because it's a Disney Channel original made for little girls. And we have to talk about the pageant scene. On the surface, this movie's ending is extremely predictable, formulaic, and shallow, even if generally satisfying. Josh wins his competition, Dylan wins her competition, the two win each other, Dylan gives her mandatory speech, and they happily kiss.
No, it's not really required of you to make a speech.
But the movie doesn't end there. There is one more scene where something extraordinary happens. It's subtle, and I missed it the first time, but think about the implications of them walking off together. An hour earlier, Dylan talked about how much she wanted to win the pageant. Josh asked her what her plans were for after the pageant, and she didn't have any.
Hopes, dreams. What's your life goal?
Blossom Queen.
After that.
After?
To her, there is nothing after the pageant. So what this scene shows us is, she's evolved past that way of thinking. The film's true climax isn't the pageant itself, it's Dylan having to face what's after the pageant, which she's finally able to do, and happily at that. This is her true evolution as a character. Winning the competition allowed her to connect with her dead mother, but walking away afterwards shows she can live for herself now. I told you this movie was good.